One of the cyber challenges that has long faced organizations is the IT skills gap. And as cybercriminals have widened their focus and moved down the food chain to target small and medium-sized businesses, that problem has become more pronounced. This is particularly true for what Confer founder and VP of Products Paul Morville describes as the IT middle class. On today's Cyber Chat, we talk with Morville about the skills gap, how it's affecting the IT middle class, and what security vendors, businesses, and others can do in order to make security easier, train a larger and more knowledgeable workforce, and ultimately keep those organizations safer. Paul, you wrote an interesting blog earlier about the IT middle class, and I thought that was a really interesting concept because it touches on a common problem we're always hearing about, which is budgeting and staffing. Seems like that's never going away. Cybersecurity services are always growing and innovating, and we're always talking, we talk about that on this podcast. So I thought it'd be interesting to talk about the flip side of it, the budgeting and the staffing side. So, would you say that that's one of the biggest obstacles for many organizations?
I would. It's interesting. I've been doing security for 10 or 15 years now, and it's very palpable these days. If you go to a conference like a Black Hat or an RSA, 5 years ago, people were going there to kind of get some new knowledge or maybe find a new customer or kind of learn something and take something away from the conference, and that is still there. But I would say first and foremost, when you go to these conferences, what you find is that they're largely recruiting events, right? Because everybody is just, always looking for new security people to add to the team. It's hard to find people, and it's hard to train people, and it's hard to retain people, and that's really palpable when you get in these sort of conferences. You kind of see that going on, and that is a change, I would say, from 5 or 6 years ago.
Yeah, I've only been covering cybersecurity for a couple of years now, but I remember when I first started, everyone was talking about this IT skills gap and the cybersecurity skills gap, and then I just saw this week, I read an article and I saw a study from the Information Systems Audit and Control Association. They said it still takes companies as long as 6 months to find qualified security candidates. So, what are your thoughts? Why is there such a big talent gap?
Yeah, so I saw the same thing, and I saw another stat recently that I thought was interesting and falls along the same lines, which is demand is only expected to get larger, right? I think it was the Bureau of Labor Statistics did a study, and they said that it's expected to increase, just the demand for cybersecurity talent is expected to increase 53% by 2018. So it's only speeding up. It's only getting harder. I think that there's really a couple of drivers here in terms of why this is a difficult problem. So the first is that security is very specialized. When you look at a security person, they're part engineer, they're part, kind of sort of researcher, they're part kind of operational in nature, they're partly a police officer, right, and somebody who's sort of familiar with doing investigations and things along those lines. And you can't go to a university right now and study that, right? There's very few kind of programs that are specialized in this area right now. And so, for the most part, companies have to kind of identify talent and then train them. And so, there's just not a huge pipeline of talent in the space. And so that's kind of part of it. The second part, though, which I think is actually the bigger driver, is there's been this real democratization or whatever in terms of who's getting attacked. If you looked at the security space 10 years ago, you tended to think about banks getting hacked, or maybe a defense industrial company. Like, these were the guys that really had to worry about sort of more sophisticated attacks against them. And I think that has just fundamentally changed in the last 5 or 6 years, where pretty much anybody, any enterprise that is more than 100 or 200 employees needs to be thinking about security. And as soon as you hit, say 500 employees or what have you, you really need somebody who has some expertise, maybe not dedicated, but some expertise in terms of understanding security. And so you've gone from kind of maybe the Fortune 500 worrying about security to a situation where I think there are 25,000 businesses in the U.S. alone with more than 500 employees. And so you've just seen this massive acceleration in terms of people who need to worry about security, people who have to acquire talent in that area. And I think that's the bigger driver. It's this sort of awareness and recognition that, really kind of any enterprise can get attacked.
Yeah, that kind of brings me back to the blog you wrote earlier this year talking about the IT middle class. It sounds to me like that's really the area that's probably lacking the most. I don't know if you'd agree with that, but just wondering if you could talk about how businesses are being affected by this.
So yeah, absolutely. So I definitely would agree with that statement. It's interesting, right? Because when you look at the high end of the market, if you go into a big bank or you go into a defense industrial company, it's not unusual, right? If you're talking to a really large, global multinational bank, that they might have 300 or 400 or 500 people doing security at that organization.
Mm-hmm.
But the number of people tends to drop off really fast when you start moving down market. So you may go to the 20th or the 30th largest bank in the world, and suddenly you can fit the security team in a single room. And, I think that plays out in even more of a meaningful way when you start moving into other verticals, right? Like the amount of resources. I think, if you look at a typical kind of large bank, they'll dedicate maybe 30% of their IT budget to security. Industry averages tend to, kind of hover somewhere in the 10% range, right? So it drops off really fast once you move kind of out of those verticals and once you start moving down market. And the impact that you see in terms of, sort of how that hits the business, we see very much at Confer in our, kind of line of business, because the customer is always asking about efficiency and training and, how do I get tools that are going to make my guys, able to be far more effective and become kind of like a force multiplier for the team versus yet another, kind of technology that I need to kind of look after and learn and train people up on. And that is it's a really common theme that I think the whole industry is talking about these days. How do you get more efficiency? How do you kind of get technologies that are going to free time up for the security people versus consume more time?
A couple of years ago, I remember I wrote an article about the Cybersecurity Skills Gap, and a few people I talked to basically said that the gap is closing, and in a couple of years, everything's going to be fine. But now here we are a couple of years later, and it's still a problem. So I guess what do you think the security industry needs to do in order to overcome this?
So I definitely think that there's really kind of a couple of different ways to tackle it. So, one is, I think I put a lot of burden back on the security vendor community in terms of trying to create products that, as I said, become more of a force multiplier, for a team versus things that are hard to use, hard to operationalize, don't tie into their workflow, and so on and so forth. And so I think that a big part of it is really recognizing that 50% of the problem is sort of focused on, security. How do I stop the bad guys, right? But 50% of the problem is also, how do I do that in a way that frees up resources on behalf of the organization that's using that technology. And I think traditionally within the security industry, within the vendor community, we've been far too focused on, building the perfect security mousetrap and not really recognizing that a human needs to operate this tool and do it in a way that's going to make them more effective. I think the preventive technologies are really important here as well. Like, really specific example, I was with a group of about 30 chief security officers actually just yesterday, and it was a long conversation about crypto wall and the effect that ransomware in general, and the effect that ransomware is having on their organizations. You have sort of this, class of attack. It's certainly not the most advanced attack in the world, right? It's fairly targeted. We're not talking about sort of spies and war games here. We're talking about a professional, attacker who's sort of just trying to extract, $500 or whatever from the organization using this ransomware attack. But the amount of time and resources that one class of attack is kind of consuming right now on behalf of these organizations is pretty eye-opening. They're having conversations, about how to better block this stuff, right, and stop it from impacting the organization. They're making contingency plans, right? What if some really important data gets encrypted and we have to pay the ransomers in this case? Like, they're asking questions like, do we have the ability as an organization to pay somebody in Bitcoin and pay that ransom, right? And so this is consuming a lot of time and resources for what I would argue in many ways is, kind of a less kind of strategic aspect of thinking about how to secure that overall organization. And, the way I tend to think about it is, if we can kind of take some of the easier stuff off the table, right? If we can do a better job of kind of preventing a lot of the really common, more commodity style attacks, right? And then if we can, allow the security organization, by taking that off of their plate to really focus on some of the more strategic aspects of how do I deal with, employee behavior? How do I deal with more sort of advanced, persistent kind of attackers, people who are more sophisticated, things along those lines? A big part of solving this problem is getting a little bit more, automation and a little bit more prevention out of the technologies that we do deploy.
Mm-hmm. I wanted to get your thoughts on another buzzword we hear all the time. Everyone's always talking about collaboration, and the different verticals need to collaborate with the government, and so that's a concept that's always getting thrown around. And just wondering your thoughts on that, because there's a lot of political discussion about it, and something that we hear about each week. Is that something that we still need more of, or do you think maybe that aspect is overblown a little?
So, I think from a hype perspective, let me take a step back. I think that one of the ways that we get ahead of this problem is through more collaboration, more sharing of data. So over the long arc of this discussion, a big proponent of that direction as an industry. If you can kind of break the problem down a little bit more, if you can benefit from some work that somebody else did in terms of protecting your own organization, there's nothing wrong with that. It's a really good thing to be doing, and I do think ultimately it's going to really help in terms of providing a collective defense. To get to your point, though, I definitely think that we're going to walk before we run there. One of the things we've done, very much as an organization is we've been very active participants, as an example, in the standardization process around intel sharing. So there are a couple of standards, STIX being one of them, which is a markup language for threat intel, standardized. A lot of different companies are using it. TAXII is another one, which is basically a mechanism for securely sharing intel across organizations. We've built that capability into our products. Like, we're big proponents of that as a business. That said, I think that these kinds of processes, move slowly. I think that, you've sort of my sort of expectations are a little bit tempered just in terms of like how quickly as an industry we're going to be able to move towards a collective defense. I think the faster we can move that way and the more we can adopt this kind of stuff, certainly the better. But I do think that that's not going to be the holy grail in the near term, right, in terms of dealing with some of these challenges. I think that what we really need to do is focus a little bit more on automation, a little bit more on analytics, and really leverage the computers to do a lot of the manual stuff that security professionals are doing today, right? When you actually drill down into, what a security person does on a day-by-day basis, an awful lot of that is sort of manual, kind of human-intensive kind of work. And if you can kind of bring more of that back into the device itself, if you can apply more kind of analytics-based approaches, if you can take more of a big data style approach, if you can kind of crunch a lot of data and allow the computer to do a lot of the heavy lifting there, that's an approach that I'm seeing a lot kind of across the industry right now. There's a lot of innovation going on there right now. I think it's really good in terms of providing better security, and because frankly computers are able to analyze large volumes of data a lot better than people are. And the second thing is that I think it's actually very good for the security professional as well, because quite honestly, one of the things humans don't generally like is pouring through large volumes of data, trying to make sense of it. And, it allows the security person to maybe take a little bit more of a step back, be a little bit more strategic about where they allocate the resources. And so I would say automation and analytics first, collaborative defense second is kind of how I would position it.
You were talking about how the security side needs to change and to evolve a little bit, and we're getting some innovation along those lines. But for those organizations who are the the IT middle class and don't really have a lot at the moment to really invest in security for whatever reason, do you have any kind of go-to advice and things that you typically kind of push them towards in terms of staying safe?
Yeah, so I definitely would take a look at some of the newer products that are out there in the marketplace. When I think about security, when I think about sort of security products for the mid-market, generally there's kind of two technologies you see again and again, just sort of the sort of nuts and bolts of security in the mid-market. You've got a firewall sitting out, on the perimeter, and you've got antivirus deployed internal to the organization. And I think there's been a tremendous amount of innovation actually in both of those areas. You've got things like next-gen firewalls, on the network side that are definitely worth taking a look at to provide more value for you. An area that's near and dear to our heart is really the endpoint side of things. There's this whole kind of next-generation antivirus space that's emerging right now that's far more effective in terms of detecting and preventing a lot of these attacks and kind of taking that burden off of the security teams and getting them out of sort of constantly being in response mode. And so I definitely want one piece of advice would certainly be to sort of look out in terms of the different technologies that are in the marketplace, because I do think that there's some better fits that are going to provide far better sort of security value than kind of those traditional staple technologies in this regard. The other thing is like continue to hold everybody to a high standard in terms of efficiency and usability and automation. I think it's okay to say, hey, we're a small team. We don't have a lot of time for complexity. We don't have a lot of time for inefficiency, and really sort of hold the providers that you do work with to a higher standard there. And I think there's other things like MSSPs and looking for places to sort of employ different services organizations in that capacity as well. But those are the kinds of things that come to mind.
Yeah, that's really all the questions I have, unless you have any final thoughts on this issue, on the skills gap or security professionals or anything along those lines.
Yeah, the only thing I'd mention at the end is I'd love to see a little bit more innovation on behalf of some of the academic institutions here as well. I mean, I'm in the Boston area here. We have a tremendous number of universities up here. And I would say that of all the universities around Boston, there's not a ton of examples. I think maybe Northeastern is the one exception, but there's not a ton of examples of universities that are even training security people in a meaningful way. And I think the more we can do, sort of in terms of feeding more people with this skill set into the funnel, the better off we'll be as well. And so I think that's another piece of the puzzle here.
All right. Well, thanks for taking the time. We appreciate it.
Oh, I really enjoyed it, Jeff. Thank you.
And that wraps up this episode of the Cyber Chat. The Cyber Chat podcast is brought to you by Surfwatch Labs. Surfwatch Labs helps organizations and service providers quickly establish a strategic cyber threat intelligence operation that drives more effective use of their tactical defenses. For a weekly recap of important cybercrime news, check out Surfwatch Labs' other podcast, the Surfwatch Cyber Risk Roundup. And for more information on cyber risk intelligence, check out surfwatchlabs.com.